welcome to the committee meetings for March 7, 2016. We have 5 items in front of us today. The first one is an ordinance approving the advance refunding of the outstanding 2007 limited sales tax obligation bonds. This ordinance authorized the issuance of limited tax general obligation refunding bonds in the aggregate principal amount of not to exceed $11 million to refund certain outstanding limited sales tax obligation bonds of the Bellingham-Whatcom Public Facilities District. This ordinance delegates authority to the Finance Director for a limited time to approve the interest rates, maturity dates, and redemption terms and principal maturities for the bonds within the parameters set by this ordinance. So that sounds very complicated, and I'm going to turn it over to Brian Henshaw, our Finance Director, who will explain it so we can all understand.
Thank you very much, Brian Henshaw, Finance Department. Because it was so complicated, I just put up a pretty picture so that you have something to look at in the meantime. This is coming up, so part of the bond refunding, we will be doing a rating of the city's creditworthiness on March 23rd. So this is a draft credit presentation that we'll present to Standard & Poor's as part of that bond refunding. But I just have one slide that I'll share with you in a moment, so I left this one up. The first 2 items today are related. The first one is the authorization to delegate the authority to me to go into the bond refunding. But first I want to start with a little bit history on the PFD, the Public Facility District. As you recall, City Council created this in 2002. It is a legislative rebate that gives back to municipalities who create regional facilities 0.033% of the sales tax, the state's portion of the sales tax, the 6.5% of the sales tax. So the city determined that we would use that money to pay for the Art and Children's Museum and also some of the renovations at the Mount Baker Theater, and proceeded to issue bonds in 2004. The city of Bellingham issued $9.4 million of bonds and then loaned that money to the Public Facility District to go out and buy the land and start construction on the Art and Children's Museum. The city guarantees those bonds, and we refunded those 2004 bonds in 2012 to take advantage of the lower interest rates in 2012. In addition, in 2007, the Public Facility District issued their own bonds for just under $10 million. That money was also used for those projects. And as part of that, the city agreed to contingently loan or do a bridge loan of $2.8 million to the PFD. And the reason they chose to do that at the time was we can save money by only issuing $10 million of debt in a year. It's called bank qualified debt, and so they knew they were going to need a little bit more than $10 million, and that's why they came up with a $2.8 million loan, but we only did a loan for a bond loan for the $10 million. So of the total now, the PFD has issued $22 million of debt to pay for those projects. And at the end of 2015, we have $18.3 million of that $22 million still outstanding. All right, so now I will show you. This is a cash flow forecast of the Public Facility District. So when we issued the debt, the assumption was made that sales tax would grow at 4.5% a year. No one anticipated the Great Recession of 2009 and 2010. And so you see we backloaded the debt payments so that there's step increases the longer we go out. But you see in 2008, we had about $1,136,000 of sales tax receipts and some other income. This is the debt service, the 2004 debt service, the 2007 debt service, and then this is the deficit or credit that we had. But you see in 2009, when the recession hit, sales tax revenue went down to just over $1 million. And we were still doing construction here, and then we also started making payments on the loan, the interfund loan. So there's 3 different debts that the public facility is responsible for. But what I really want you to show you is out here, as the debt increases in 2019, In 2018, this starts increasing as was planned in the original bonds that were issued, and you see it just grows. So currently it's about $1.2 million of debt service that we owe, and this grows between now and 2027 all the way up to over $2 million a year in debt service payments. So to try to compensate for that, we've refunded the 2004 bonds. We're now going to propose to refund the 2007. But another way that we can save money is to issue these as city bonds rather than the PFD bonds. And the reason for that is the city has a higher credit rating than the public facility district. You might recall that Wenatchee Public Facility District, they built a small arena over there, very optimistic on the revenue forecast, and got into financial trouble right out of the gate. So because of that, the city's credit rating would earn us a lower interest rate, save us some additional money, and that's the proposal for you today, is to issue these as city general tax obligation bonds. They will still be paid back by the PFD sales tax refund, but it will lower the obligation that the city will have to do out in the 2019-2020 timeframe, when I'm forecasting that we'll have to supplement the sales tax revenue just because it won't be high enough. Well, in around 2019. So it depends on how fast sales tax continues to grow. We've had pretty good growth rate. It's about 3% this year. It's not going to be enough to pay for it all, I can tell you that. But hopefully we can either postpone it one more year, 2020, with the refunding. It depends on the market rates when we go out to the market also. Our credit rating will also make a determining factor on that. So there's a lot of things that we'll find out here in the future. But this ordinance in front of you today will delegate the authority to me for 120 days with the criteria. The criteria are listed on page 33 of your packet under sale of bonds. It specifies the amount, the time frame, the interest rate savings, that the parameters that I have to work with. But as we get closer to that time frame, the market rates are changing on a daily basis, obviously, and so it'll all be dependent upon that. So are there any questions on that? That's a lot of information on the PFD and the bonds, but and the next item is on the interlocal just between the city that specifies that.
Councilmember Lillquist.
As you mentioned, Wenatchee's gotten in over its head with their PFD, and our situation is nowhere near as dire as that. But also there are, I think, half a dozen or more around the state who are more in our situation, not quite in Wenatchee's situation. And the state legislature is considering changes to the PFD regulations. I think that would just simply extend the payback period, extend the period of tax rebate. Right. If that does occur, does that interact with this? Does it just put us in a better position, or does it mean that this needs to be done again one more time because the period needs to be extended?
Yeah. That's a great question. There's a House Bill 2296 that passed, I think it was 96-0 out of the House, but not in the Senate. So there's continued legislative fixes that are in the works. The interlocal agreement, the next item, will address that, but we are anticipating that they will continue to fix or try to fix the legislation, but we're not counting on it. So we are going to pre-refund to save as much money as we can today. That's a known. But the bond certificate that's part of the next agenda item and the way that we're structuring the loan is in anticipation of a fix, and if it gets extended or they allow us to. Right now it all ends when our bonds are paid off, so it will end in 2027, and we want to leave the door open in case there is a legislative fix that extends it so that we could continue to collect the sales tax revenue. So we'll try to anticipate that.
Great.
Council members, any more questions?
Okay.
No?
If you'd like, we can go right into the interlocal agreement like Michael was saying and then come back and vote on it, or you can vote if you're comfortable now. It kind of is.
I'll move approval of the ordinance.
Okay.
Second.
Have a motion in front of us, which has been seconded. Any questions, concerns? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 7-0. So we are going to move on to the second part of this, which is authorizing the mayor to enter into the interlocal financing agreement with the Bellingham Walken Public Facilities District. And Brian Henshaw, I will just let you explain that one.
Great. Thank you. So we'll go right into it. The interlocal agreement will clarify the responsibilities of both the city and the PFD, but as I mentioned before, the city will be issuing these bonds. It'll be about $10 million in bonds again. We will pre-refund, meaning that we will put it into an escrow account, and then at the December 1st of 2017, when the PFD bonds are callable, the escrow account will call all of the outstanding bonds. We, at the same time, will enter into this interlocal agreement. The interlocal agreement will loan the PFD the $10 million. As part of what Michael asked earlier, there's a certificate that will be issued from the PFD to the City of Bellingham that will outline all of the money that they owe, which is this $10 million, about $8.5 million of the prior loan, and then also the interfund loan of $1.8 million. In total, $18 million. And they're pledging all of the sales tax receipts and any other revenue that they will receive as the public facility district, and then we'll use that to pay as much of the debt service as we can. The slide I have up here is to show you, in anticipation of this, as part of the bond refunding presentation, you'll see that we've added in 2 new bonds. This is all of the general tax bonds that the city has issued. We have all of this out here. The 2012 is the refunded public facility district bond and civic field, and then the 2016 A and B. Because we'll go over the $10 million, we'll have to do some of this as tax exempt and some of it as taxable. And that's the anticipated amounts depending on where the market is on the day that we issue them, which will be April 6th. And then we also list out other non-voted general obligation debt. You'll notice that some of this is not general fund debt that we think of as the normal just general fund. There's some street loans, the EDI loan. This COP, Certificate of Participation, is what we use to pay for all the street lights that we're putting on LED lights. So this is the general fund that includes 12 special revenue funds that we report on the CAFR as part of one unit. So that's why they're all included in this. But for the tax purposes and also the payment purposes for Standards & Poor's, we look at it in total. Let's see. And then, as I mentioned before, Michael brought up a good point. It is flexible so that if there is a change in the legislation, we hope that it will be extended. It has a lot of support, but it's difficult times for the state to come up with the added resources that would be diverted from the state's general fund to pay for this program. So we'll continue to monitor it and see if we want to lobby for that, but we'll have to just, there's 12 years left basically, and we'll see what can happen in that. Any questions on the interlocal?
Councilmember Barker.
Can I get a copy of this slide?
Yep.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. I'd entertain a motion.
I'll move to approve.
Second.
We have a motion to enter into the interlocal financing agreement. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 7-0. Thank you, Brian. Next item in front of us is an ordinance establishing fees for rental inspection. Our City Council adopted the ordinance in March 9th, 2015, establishing a rental registration and inspection program. Based upon council direction, the fee schedule identified as Exhibit A is proposed, and that will be explained by our Planning and Community Director, Rick Sepler.
Good afternoon, members of the council. I come before you today with the last step of implementation. You might ask, since you adopted registration fees almost 7 months ago, what took us so long to figure out the inspection implementation fees? As council might recall, we had a number of unknowns associated with our software system and the number of properties that ultimately would be found to be inspected. Those issues have now been resolved, and in the spreadsheet that's included It includes the work-through of all the facilities, the computer software, and the various implementation devices necessary. A couple of things about that. I think our early estimates had us somewhere at $97 per unit per every 3 years, meaning it'd be about $33 a year, plus or minus. It came up about $3 at the end of the day when we looked at the final numbers for all of the component parts, and also to ensure that we had adequate funding for both staff for inspection, as well as to note the results of the inspection itself. Some might ask, why is there a fee for the folks associated with private inspection, meaning that our inspectors are going out? Well, the fee is proposed largely because the city still has to notify the property owner, needs to record the result of the inspection, and needs to follow up to ensure it occurs in a timely manner. Only those costs associated with those functions have been allocated, and hence why it's about a $45 charge. That's actually the assessed cost for the computer system, the tracking, the person to contact them, follow up, and review it. In looking at the schedule itself, you'll note that consistent with prior council direction, there is no charge for the first reinspection. And I should note, most inspections can be completed on one visit. If it's a very simple issue, like you need a new battery for the fire detector, we'll do a correction notice and we won't return. It's up to the proponent at that point to follow through because they've agreed to do those minor kind of repairs. However, there might be issues where we have a bedroom where the window is frozen, can't be opened. That's significant enough that we wouldn't do a correction notice. We would come back the second time, make sure it's operable for egress and for life safety. Hence why no charge, because basically we're just following through on a critical issue. However, there are going to be opportunities that will present themselves to us where we have a number of things that are more pronounced, but we see a good property owner working through the issue. But it will require successive review, meaning that we need you to get this far, we need to come back and make sure you're making good progress. We want to get the imminent risk solved first and those other issues that are health safety secondly. And that's why we have second reinspection fee and final reinspection fee. In terms of appointments, we do have a missed appointment fee. We send a notice out to that 1/3 of the city, to that one area of that 1/3 of the city that we're going to inspect. Folks have the ability to contact us and reschedule if they're not available during that time. Happy to do that. We understand it's complex. Sometimes you may have to make arrangements. However, once we make that agreement that you're going to be there, we dispatch our folks in the most economical way to reduce these costs. If not provided prior notice, we arrive and you're not there, we have to go through the expense of rescheduling, and that's why the fee is assessed. Fees are payable after the final inspection, either passage or failure, meaning if you go all the way through and not before. And after the fees are paid, we will be sending a certificate of inspection for posting within the unit itself. And that's the certification for the future renter that it's passed muster. We did establish other fees, and those are for a late fee and for the appeal to the hearing examiner. As council is aware, the original ordinance allowed for an appeal to the hearing examiner if there's dispute, but we didn't establish a specific fee. It's incorporated into this ordinance. And the late fee is a standard one in terms of collection. You've passed, you haven't gotten your certificate, but we need to collect the dollars. Happy to answer any questions you might have regarding the fees as proposed.
Councilmember Knutson?
Yes,
And
on the,
Barker.
I forgot what page I was on here. On page, where
61?
the hearing examiner fee, do you add those two together? Is that $1,081?
Yes, and that's our standard fee.
That's a standard fee, okay.
Councilmember Barker, then Murphy.
So the city can do some of the inspections, or you can hire private, which is the
That's
extra fee
correct.
to get. So are we hiring any new inspectors?
Yes, the approved supplemental budget included funding for an additional inspector.
Okay.
It's one, and in our next matter, for example, we won't have one inspector doing all of the inspections. All of our inspectors will do it, but if you added up their portion of time, it's one FTE.
So that's why the planner number 1, is that?
That's the next issue we'll be discussing,
Okay.
yes. And largely, not one planner will be doing all of the enforcement on this matter, but if you divide it out, 25% of 4 planners, for example, might be doing it.
Councilmember Murphy, then Hamel.
Just a quick question on whether this factored in complaints that are going to come in versus inspections that we've set up ahead of time.
Very good point. The next matter before you is dealing with the change from a OA to a clerical support, administrative support, to a planner 1 specifically to deal with the complaint issue.
So, but that had
It's-
no impact on the fees?
It would be included through the next amendment, yes.
Got it, okay.
Couple questions. On page 62 of the packet, per unit private inspector's $45 fee. What is the fee that a private inspector would charge beyond that to the individual?
We're required by state law, as you know, to have private inspectors allowed. That comes from the PASCO decision in terms of allowing others to do the work. It would be market rate. We don't anticipate many private inspections, excepting if you have a large complex, it might be in your financial benefit to hire someone, and they'll negotiate a specific fee for that. So we don't regulate it. It might be more than we charge, it might be less.
I guess that was my, where I was going with that is, is the fee that the city charges ultimately less than what the private market would charge, in addition with this $45 fee?
I have a sense that we'd be extraordinarily competitive. And again, the only circumstance I could see, which was anticipated, would be a large property owner with many units would hire someone who is certified by us. They've had to take a class. We basically have an affidavit they sign that they've met the criteria and inspection, and we have the ability in the ordinance, as you might recall, if we find a violation or an error in one of those inspections, to inspect all of those units in the complex that was inspected. So we do have recourse against someone who is abusing the system, and we also allow for someone who's competent doing the good work to do it too.
And then are you wanting to discuss attachment A on page 63 as part of the next discussion, or do you?
It's just a summary of the way we calculated the fee, and basically it includes the Planner 1, which we talked about. That's the addition which you would approve through your next action, as opposed to an OA2, which was originally budgeted. That's a change. It includes the dollars for enforcement that's allocated, the allocated department cost, which is our time for dealing with all of the issues associated with implementing it, because clearly direction was to make sure it covered its costs when implemented through it. It includes the costs allocated for training those private inspectors. We do have dollars that are included to provide support for certain qualifying populations, low income, dealing with the nature that some units we inspect may not be adequate, and we might have to unfortunately exit people immediately. We have a risk, so we're looking to work forward on that. And then it goes through the actual computer program and its maintenance. That was the unknown before. Thanks to the very good work of our IT department and a very consolidated team between PCD and IT, we have a really good handle on the cost now. We're implementing as we speak. They're developing the specific scripts and software, but we feel comfortable in the amount. Includes the equipment we have to purchase. We have to buy computers to do this, as well as iPad for the inspector, software for the iPad, telephones, the smartphone. This is an additional trip where someone's out there in the field all day, and we actually have to get a vehicle that needs to be dedicated to have someone do the inspections, because all the other vehicles are in use for other functions of the city. And finally, the operation and maintenance of that. We did include a contingency reserve, and that is we will likely come back after we have some data of a year of inspections, and we might be able to adjust the fees. Certainly after 3 years, we'll be able to adjust the fees, having gone through all the population, and maybe even recommend the frequency of inspections. We might be able to extend them at that point. But we felt more comfortable with some of the unknowns, both in enforcement as well as the number of trips we have to do, to include a small contingency reserve. Any savings we find compared to this budget would go back to the public in the next fee.
Councilmember Barker, then Hamel, then Lillquist.
So it sounded like you guys already had one training or a pseudo training
Yes.
for people to come forward. In that, did you talk with, or did somebody speak with the potential inspectors that would be private to see if this fee was going to be within what they would expect? So that if I, as a property owner, want to hire somebody beyond the city, did you get some feedback from
We
them
did
to see
do
if?
a couple of things. We actually had a focus group that brought in folks who were property owners, realtors. We explained the fee. They were somewhat surprised we were charging when others were doing the inspection, but we outlined, as you see on the far right of the page 63, the cost to the city, just to send the letters up, arrange it, follow up, notice it, and deal with the issues, that we do incur costs. So they understood it. I think the city has really made a significant effort. We've strove to reduce our cost for inspection to make it more affordable. In some senses, it does make it more difficult for a private inspector to make the dollars, but they certainly will have those opportunities in larger complexes.
So I guess that's my concern as far as the city. I would want, as a property owner, the ability to pick my own private and have it be pretty close to the same cost. And if we're overly competitive, we could be taking work from a private inspector or forcing somebody that's financially conscious about that to feel like they're forced to use the city because the expense of using a private is going to be so much more. So, you know, in talking with some inspectors, they thought it could be about 30 minutes. It seemed like a pretty quick thing to go through, but they also have to get there. And so I guess I'm interested in, is there a point when this gets going, instead of a year, where in 3 months, if we start getting some feedback, that we can relook, or is this pretty much going to be set for the year and then we'll relook
I
at
think
it
for the
then?
first year, it's probably likely we'd probably be able to look at the totality of what we expended, how many privates were done, and what we actually incurred in cost. We keep very good records, so we'll be able to find out how much time it really did take. The big unknown, too, is that we believe there'll be a significant enforcement component to this. And we also believe that that's going to bear a cost that may change it upward. We think we've given significant allocation of time, but we'll see, because we're unknown what we're going to find till we do it the first time. So I guess the sense would be is after a year we can come back and look at the fees themselves. It is a challenge because we had a cross direction. One was to get the lowest cost to the public, but also to make sure that there was a venue for a private inspector to move forward on. There's no one doing these private inspections now. This is new industry.
Yeah.
So in essence, we're not displacing anyone doing it, but we aren't also creating another job category.
That'll be interesting to look at. Thank you.
Councilmember Hamel, then Lillquist.
Thank you. I'm trying to, I've got a couple questions here. I'm trying to do the math here at the bottom where you've got the number of inspections at 8,370. That's total.
Right.
I'm sorry, per year or total? Of,
It's about 2,700 inspections per year.
Okay, correct. All right.
Right.
Right, yeah, so yeah, 8,370 divided by 3 is about 2,700. But a couple lines below that, it says inspections per year per inspector, 75% of available time, 2145. I'm trying to reconcile the 27 to the 2145.
We were coming back and saying that, optimally, we think we could do it. Some of the inspections that are coming up are going to be for new units, and we think the person doing the final can do the inspection concurrently because you're doing a final, those kind of issues. In other instances, we might be at the location itself, and others we also think we factored in the amount of units that might go to private sector. We had 500 and, if I'm not mistaken, 58 units going to private in this calculus.
Okay.
I think if you add those up, it adds up to
Okay,
truth.
that makes more sense. And I just have one more follow-up question. So this is an annual schedule that we're looking at here. So under your low-income tenant support, it's $5,000 for emergency relocation expense, and then $10,000 for legal assistance out of, over 2,000 inspections per year. I'm just wondering what the formula on that is. How did you arrive at that number? It just seems low to me.
We were looking to see, what we're trying to do is access people. Folks are protected by landlord-tenant. That's the good thing. But however, a lot of folks who are challenged economically may not have the wherewithal to get an attorney to go forward to recollect those dollars that are due them under landlord-tenant. This provides the vehicle. We'd likely contract there's a not-for-profit that might very well provide the service. It's providing a service and some very limited emergency relocation. One thing that affected this is that we do think, we're hopeful we won't find many cases where we have to red tag the property, where we go in as an inspector says it's unsafe and you can't stay here tonight. We have had discussions with, for example, Western Washington University, who asked us to delay the start of the inspection process till after the first of the year because they've made a guarantee to use their dorm facilities for anyone so displaced. So a student who had to leave would do it. So now we're dealing with folks who are economically challenged who have no other place to go. And we think this might be a start. We do have that reserve. We can move that up there. And again, if we run over, we'll adjust the fee accordingly for the following year.
Okay, thanks.
Councilmember Lillquist, do you have a question?
Well, actually, Rick, you've answered half of it. I also focused on the low-income tenant support. I really appreciate that part of the program, and I do understand that it won't be used, hopefully not very much, that actually red tagging will be a rare event. But how will that be administered? Who, the eligibility, is that, I guess not so much for my sake, because I'm not a renter right now, but how will we publicize that so that people know that's there, that they won't be afraid if their place is red tagged, that there'll be an exit strategy for them?
I think we're going right now developing those procedures so that if we run into that instance where we have an inspector on site and it's unsafe and cannot be occupied, we have gone through a script and we'd have that information that would be pre-prepared.
You just hand the person the brochure,
we
bad
would have a
news,
sheet
red
that says,
tags.
here's exactly what to do, here are resources if you qualify, and it would explain it, here's where to go, those kind of things. Again, we won't be starting the inspections till probably the end of, it'll be next quarter, actually January, March, it'll be next quarter, and probably towards the end of that, we're mobilizing at this point. But we should have that all prepared beforehand. And as Council recalls, in the ordinance, they allowed the department to promulgate those kind of handouts, forms, and we're working on them.
Great. Councilmember Borneman.
Yep. Two things. One, I want to thank the department for listening to what the council had said in terms of trying to keep the inspection price as low as possible for the consumer with that. And I think you've done a pretty good job with this. So that said, I want to move approval.
Second. And I just want one last question. On an apartment complex of 300 or 400 units, are those inspected randomly? I forgot.
There's a percentage that's selected when you pass a number of units, and they select them randomly. However, if we find any of the units we select fail, we get to inspect them all. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. We have a motion to pass the ordinance of establishing fees for rental inspection. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 7-0. We have part 2 of this. It's the budget amendment to allow the reclassification of an office assistant 2 to a planner 1 in the Planning and Community Development Department. And Rick, I'm going to let you take that over.
Okay. When we originally envisioned this, we thought our biggest challenge might be the scheduling of the inspections and the need to deal with the adjustment and the workload that was placed on staff. As we spent more time developing that process, we found that there were certain economies, and our existing staff funded through the rental registration component could have double usage to do that. Sure presents for a busy 9 months of solid work and then a lot of catch up in terms of clerical work associated with it, but we have very good people involved. However, the issue that is rising is dealing with enforcement of illegal units that are discovered as part of this process, either through separate enforcement requests coming in from neighborhood or through our own knowledge. And although we have excellent code enforcement capacity at the police department, The challenge with that is that each one of these is very complex in terms of its provenance. When it was legally established, whether it's a pre-existing legal non-conforming use or whether it's just an illegal use. And each one has its own set of facts, depending on what zoning code was in place when they were established, after they demonstrate when they came online. Towards that end, we think the best way is to have someone who is expert in our zoning code have the dedicated time to work their way through all of the enforcement issues as to zoning, and then turn them over to the code enforcement officer when resolution is reached or conclusion is reached. This has worked very well in terms of the registration component. We've had, we anticipated about 15,000 units to register. We actually had 18,823 units register, significantly more. And of those, we winnowed it down to about 400 units that we had on our system, but we didn't receive any information from. Further research on that indicates that we'll kind of work our way through them one at a time. To be honest, we drove by some of the addresses and there's nothing there. So we think they're in compliance then. The true issue, though, is that we did find 64 property owners with multiple properties, as many as 10. And we followed through by doing the diligent research on each one and then turned it over to code compliance. As of last week, for the 64 that went to code compliance, 25 have been sent violation notices, 8 properties were registered, 6 are due to be registered this week, 4 properties were identified as non-rentals, exempt from registration, 4 haven't returned their certificated mail return receipt, and 3 are due for follow-up action. They get ticketed. So in essence, we've made significant inroads to do enforcement. We see a similar need going into the inspection component with those illegal units, and we see this being the best way to allow our code enforcement folks to follow through with all the facts in front of them. So we propose to you to do a modification to the budget that would allow for a OA2, which was budgeted, to be replaced by a Planner 1, a full-time Planner 1, for that purpose. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have on that.
Councilmember Murphy, then Lillquist.
If you get into a situation of community complaints and there's a backlog, how would you prioritize which would get addressed at the point that they came in, or the number of complaints or issues?
We have a standard right now. If it's a life safety complaint, it goes immediately to the top of the list. And we're out there that day. It's a sense of urgency. If it's an issue of, I looked at the list of registered properties and there's a unit on my block that's not on the list, and I'm pretty sure they're renting it out. We'll take it in the order we received it, and we'll work our way through it. There are some economies of looking in similar areas at the same time, especially doing plat research or things like that. That might move one up. If you want to say, well, this whole area developed, there were several units that went in at the same time, it might be an efficiency. But typically it's the order received, after life safety order received.
Thank you.
Yeah, Rick, I know one of the words you like to use is nimble, and I appreciate that you have been nimble, and the way you're modifying the program, I think, is an improvement and responds to the actual needs, and so I would move approval of this budget ordinance.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion in front of us for the budget amendment approval. Any discussion? Any other questions? Councilmember Barker.
So I'm glad that you're taking the illegal issue that's been coming up for well over a year very seriously, and having a person dedicated. I think that's going to make it a lot simpler for people to have one person they can go to that's an expert. So I appreciate that. And I've heard numbers as high as, when the Planning Commission was talking, as people thinking there's more than 500 units that might not be in compliance. So coming from 64 to that, I'm going to be supporting it in the sense that I think this person's going to be busy and really hopefully fixing a problem that's been an issue in neighborhoods for a long time.
If I might, I gave you the numbers that were for registration only, not inspection, and it didn't deal with the complaints that had come in. We anticipate as many as 800 units might come in under complaint for legality as to zoning, and we'll follow up on it. And I should also say that although we'll be having an FTE equivalent for it, we need to be agile. That's almost as good as nimble. And we might have the 4 planners each take 25% of enforcement the first year, or we might do 80% with one individual if we could find the right new individual. We'll see, but there will be a point of contact.
Councilmember Murphy.
Will we be doing community outreach about this to let people know that they can file complaints or the like?
Yeah, I've been in meeting with the neighborhood associations. We've let them know this is coming. They've asked, do you have a final list? I said, we're rapidly approaching it. We're going through our last enforcement actions, and there will be what we call an audited list. Right now, you can go online at cob.org, and you can get every rental property that's been registered. If you see a property is absent from that list, and we'll be finalizing it very shortly, you can certainly inform us through complaint, and we'll investigate.
Just a quick follow-up. Will we do specific outreach to the colleges? Because I think this would really help them.
That's a great point. We've been to their housing fair, and we actually had our booth. Our specialist, Emma Bernfeld, did a yeoman-like job presenting to them. We've been working with the Campus Community Coalition as part of our town ground to get the message out and make sure folks know. One of our best disincentives for deterrence, I should say, for illegal housing is to say, look for the certificate and understand the number of people that are allowed in the unit. And we've been working on that too. So yes, we've been making a significant outreach.
Councilmember Parker.
So I was at Housing for Hash Browns and enjoyed Emma's talk. They also videotaped it, so in the you're coming back in the evening, I'm assuming. I think there's a link. It was great information on mold, the certification process, what's going to cost your landlord, what to expect, and I imagine some people watching might want to have that resource. So when you come back in the evening, can we get that?
Sure, and what I could do is if folks went to our website under rental registration, we have a page, we'll put it right there.
Okay,
I'll make it easy.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, again, we have a motion which has been seconded to approve the budget amendment to allow reclassification for an enforcement team. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 7-0. Our last item in front of committee today is the overview of level of service and proposed review processes. At our February 22nd meeting, Council requested a background briefing on levels of service, otherwise known as LOS. LOS standards are measures of the minimum amount of a public facility or service which must be provided to meet that community's basic needs and expectations. Bellingham has adopted LOS standards for streets, fire, police, services, and parks. Once a community establishes LOS, they are used to measure whether existing facilities and services are adequate to serve its citizens, or whether there are deficiencies that should be corrected. At this briefing, PCD staff will provide an overview of LOS and propose a process with which to review and address potential revisions in context of forthcoming capital facilities plan element, comprehensive plan, and city budget development. I'm going to turn this over to Rick Seppler and Moshe Quinn for our presentation.
Okay, well, I'll start off just to frame our presentation and talk a little bit about the proposed review schedule. As council might recall, we're in the midst of updating our comprehensive plan, and a component part of our comprehensive plan is the capital facilities element or capital facilities plan. The CFP provides a 20-year framework for establishing capital facilities and ultimately affecting the operational costs of facilities in the city. And in doing so, concern was raised during our initial review a number of months ago regarding the long-term sustainability of being able to apply our level of service as we grow as a community and be able to do it in an effective measure. In looking at that, a specific goal is to ensure that we have adequate funding to implement the plan predictably and provide the services that we value to the community. In looking at that, as noted by the finance director and others, there is a challenge facing us in about 2 years. At that point, the city's general fund reserves will reach a level where they meet the minimum as established by policy. And in doing that, what we want to do is find a way where we can address that issue before it becomes a crisis, where we could deal with the nature of what the problem is and find better solutions while we can still calmly but vigorously discuss it. In doing so, we are charged with preserving what's important for Bellingham and preserving the vital services that our community needs and appreciates. This is going to be a different kind of issue that we face. This is an issue that in the past we typically deal with technical change or technical issues. A good example of that would be how we deal with budgets. We have desires and we have revenues, and we say we'll push something to the future, or we'll choose not to do this, or we won't do as much of that, and we balance the budget. As an organization, the city is well equipped to deal with that. We deal with it on a basis, highly professional. It's familiar to us. We have skills to deal with it. That technical change or challenge is not going to resolve this kind of issue effectively. What we really need to look at is a more adaptive challenge. That's because we acknowledge that we have issues that are greater than can be solved quickly, that they are going to take a great deal of discussion and talk and comparison, that the community as a whole needs to weigh in on it, and we need to come up with a roadmap that allows us to do what's best for the community. Towards that end, that adaptive challenge was framed when Peter Moy came from FCS and showed the nature of the problem itself. And our goal clearly is to find that sustainable outcome so that the cliff disappears, that we have a plan we can implement, and we consider that a significant gift we give to the community, having solved that issue and ensuring sustainability in the future. So today, we're going to start with, you requested at that briefing a quick primer on level of service, and Moshe is going to provide that. We won't be discussing level of service today. This is just the first step. It's a background briefing, and we need to get the gloves, I think. But we will in subsequent sessions really talking about it and talk about what it means and talk about alternatives. It's not about cuts alone. It's about enhancements in certain areas. It's about accommodating the growth that's coming with the right size of government. After Moshe is done, I'll talk a little bit about a proposed process that would lead to your retreat so we can start that discussion on level of service and the future. I'm going to turn it over to Moshe now.
Thank you, Rick. Moshe Quinn with the Planning and Community Development Department. So first I want to go into what level of service is a measurement of minimum amount of public facilities and services that must be provided to meet communities' basic needs and expectations. So there's different types of level of service we adopt, as well as other services to ensure that adequate facilities are provided. GMA only requires level of service standards for transportation, which currently it's level E citywide. And as I mentioned, cities may adopt other level of service standards for government services for water, sewer, stormwater, fire, police, and parks, etc. With the water, sewer, and stormwater, the city has adopted comprehensive system plans, which are also approved by the state to ensure that we meet state requirements for providing those facilities. As well as with fire and EMS, we have also adopted state times for providing emergency services. And I will go into police and parks a little bit more as we go through the slides. So currently, the Bellingham Fire Department maintains a 1, 4, and 8-minute response time, depending on what type of the emergency is. With the 2016 update, we still plan to move forward with these same standards. In regards to the Bellingham Police Department, the 2006 comprehensive plan basically outlines 1 officer per 1,000 residents or 1 officer per 750 calls for service. They are looking at a new methodology that was prepared by Eco Solutions that takes into other considerations, that basically compares calls and service with the number of officers necessary to handle the calls and type available to answer the calls, as well as discretionary and administrative time and some other factors. They say this provides a more realistic of what needs are for the police departments when they're trying to provide this type of service. And so this is something that we will be looking at with the 2016 update. Currently, for the park's level of service, it's resident population with a half mile of a park or trail. Basically, it's a half-mile radius drawn in several different areas of the city, and that's how they look at measuring this type of level of service. With the 2016 comp plan update, they're looking at basing it a half mile based on a pedestrian network. So some sort of pedestrian sidewalk leading to a trail system or park would be looked at. And so this is also going through the comp plan updates, going to Planning Commission later on this month, and so they'll be going through that process, and we'll be bringing this back to you once again. Now, the library department is proposing a brand new level of service. They don't currently have a level of service standard in the 2006 comp plan, but they would like to have one in the 2016 update. What they're proposing is a 3-tiered system of 0.6 square foot per capita, 0.8 square foot per capita, and 1.0 per capita. So based on the current library system, based on current population, right now we're meeting a low minimum level of service that they're looking for. So as the population increases, or as if we want to tier up to a medium or high, additional library capacity would be needed within the planning period. And I could turn this back over to Rick now for some key questions.
I'll just say level of service, and we have level of service for the community, the things we'll be discussing in the future, are things that aren't like established standards. It's like how long ago forgive me, I clipped off. Level of service as established to meet the requirements of the capital facilities plan is only established for some narrow portions of what we do, largely because they're tied to metrics associated with new facilities and the staffing of those facilities. But the concept of level of service is much broader. In a community, it's how long does a permit take to get reviewed? That's a measure of service. How often is a street swept? Things like that. How many times do you have outreach or fairs to the schools from some facilities? How much public information? Those aren't specific levels of service, but they reflect a service level we provide forward. So in thinking about that, we'll talk about the ones that are adopted in the comp plan, and we'll also talk broadly about other programs and things we do in terms of meeting the needs of the public. As we go forward, if we acknowledge that we have those established levels of service and that we have to address how to fund them into the future, that's state law, there are a number of questions we should look at. The first are there any steps we should take today? Clearly, should we consider some things now that might buy additional time to allow us to perfect better solutions that might help us move forward? The second is, are there ways we could reduce costs? Are there programs or scope or scale that could be eliminated? And what would those outcomes be in level of service? Would it be something folks would know? Would it be something that would be acceptable? We should really do that hard work and look at it. Are there possible efficiencies? Are there consolidations? Are there ways of repurposing some of the effective tools we have that might provide better service delivery and save some dollars? And these are all good questions to go at. And finally, what approaches are possible that we can use to preserve or enhance those valued services? So in looking at that, what we would suggest is not to reinvent the wheel. We do that first by saying this community has done a number of very good studies that involved a great deal of time from both staff and community members as well as representatives of the council to look at issues. What we do is come back on the 21st, talk about those interim steps. What are the things we should do right now that help preserve our options for the future? That could be a good policy that might postpone that cliff date, move it back some, and give us good guidance on that. There was a series of studies done in 2009 and 2010. The first is the FAST report, and it's an acronym for Fiscal Alternative for Stability Task Force. And they looked closely at operations and services provided by the city, and they came up with a number of recommendations. We best come back and say what was recommended, what have we done, what's yet undone, is it still applicable? And similarly, in 2010, a Capital Facilities Task Force, faced with the recession and need, looked at some of the expenditures and came back with a number of recommendations. And equally, there were a number that were implemented. There are a number yet to be implemented. We need to come back and say, are those still applicable? Can they be employed? In many cases, circumstances might have changed. In some cases, the low-hanging fruit was taken easily, but the harder ones are still out there and still might be viable, and now might be the time to pick them up and advance them to move forward. And we'll give you an update on all those changes. Lastly, there was in 2014 a review that looked at administration structure and said, is there a better way of organizing to avoid duplicity and be able to focus greater emphasis on what's important? You should be updated on that similarly. Taken together, I think at the end of that briefing, you'll have a pretty good sense of the background, and we'll all be working from a common set of facts. Our hope would be to come back on the 11th and then start the level of service discussion and talk about some of the implications on it. If we decrease something, what does it mean? If we increase something, what does it mean? If we change something, what does it mean? So that you can get your arms around what those, when you move that lever in each direction, what does it do? What we would propose, if you agree, is to come to the council retreat on the 16th with a series of different approaches. And these are very 50,000-foot level, to prompt a discussion where you could say, well, I don't like that at all, and I think that one has merit, but I take one from column A and one from column D, and I think, have you thought about this new idea that hasn't been discussed? So that as your staff, we could consider some of the issues that are associated with it and come back to you with more refined approvals and processes to explore it. So we would suggest this schedule. It leads up to April. It's a sense of building one step at a time to a good discussion. And I would imagine this is a lively discussion that will continue for a number of months into the future. We'd be happy to answer any questions you might have at this time.
I'm going to start. Just wanted to let our council know that we have discussed that Mark, our research analyst, will be joining him for some of these meetings and will be able to provide us any of the research on things that we're wondering about. So just know that we will all be doing this in unison, so we'll be prepared for these conversations. Okay, I believe Councilmember Borneman was first. And then
Yeah, just a comment regarding what you'd said about the level of establishing level of services for parks. You stated the distance, but I believe you left out the other part of the equation that's even the bigger issue, is how many acres per population that's included with that. Because I believe that was established by looking at what we have and dividing population to establish it, even though we have some parklands that we had huge donations, Watcom Falls Park, Cornwall Park, and then we got brought in, the whole Lake Padden Park, and now the 100-acre woods that skews the amount on that. So it's not just a half-mile distance, it's how much land or how much parkland is in there, and that's, I think, the part we're going to have to, the real serious part we have to look at.
You're absolutely correct. What I have written down here on my notes is 35.8 acres of parkland per 1,000 people is what I had in there.
Yeah.
I apologize. I thought I had it in here until actually it got put into the system. And
No, that's
it's out
okay.
there.
I just wanted to make sure for fellow council people that we need to be looking at that when we go forward.
Yes, and that will be, I think it's identified. I just looked at the draft park pro plan, and that is identified in there.
Yeah, thank you.
Councilmember Lillquist, then Barker.
Actually, Terry, that's going to be a really good lead into some of my comments. I'm wondering, Rick, if there isn't a missing key question number 5, which really is, have we picked the right way to measure level of service? There's an old bit of wisdom in management. You manage what you measure. And if you're measuring the wrong thing, then you're achieving a goal that may be to the left or the right or not actually where you want to go. Acres per 1,000, I know that's a standard used across the country, but it may be not a very good standard. It may be that more direct measures of availability and accessibility, like the walking distance measure, and maybe even factoring in the quality of what's available within walking distance. Those are better measures, and acres per 1,000, in a sense, maybe should be downgraded as one of our measures. On the police, for example, I think our police have adopted a really good approach to policing. We're a community dedicated to community policing, and our police chief has said that he would like for each patrol officer to spend half of their time reacting to calls, but have half of their time available to be proactive, getting to know their community, finding problems before they occur, preventing crimes rather than responding to them. That is a policy level decision about how we police our community. It'd be nice if that was a level of service. Officers per 1,000 residents or something, I think completely misses the mark. I'd like us to add the missing key question, number 5, are we measuring it the right way?
Councilmember Barker.
So mine kind of comes on the heels of Michael's. I got a really interesting alert on my email, that one of those things you sign up for different magazines and things that talk about planning. It was a really fascinating article on, of course, place matters, and being one of our legacies of a sense of place. I found it really interesting how some communities are having this discussion about when we silo these levels of service, we're not talking about what's the space that we're making. We get so focused and honed in on the stormwater and of course fire and police are very important, but parks. Whereas if the top tier is we need to create amazing spaces for our neighbors that are accessible and integrated, then those levels of service kind of hopefully all come together. Maybe that's not every 1,000, people need to have so many park spaces because the park that's there is so centrally located and, accessible and large. So I think it kind of goes along with your number 5, and that not to reinvent the wheel, but develop language within our level of service that allows us to have that flexibility to be nimble when it comes to level of service and development. I think that because it's in our legacies, that's going to be really important, but we should keep an eye out on the language that might need to change in the economic chapter, because it's very heavy on we provide a very high level of service. So just to keep that there, if we do make some changes, that we might just need to tweak that language a little bit to talk a little bit more about sense of place and space. So that's my feedback.
Councilmember Hamel.
Thank you. My question is along the lines of what Michael brought up, and it's specific to a couple of programs that the city has now that we didn't have a year ago, and that's the Community Paramedic Program and the Neighborhood Patrol Officer NPO program, or Police Officer Program, rather. And so I'm wondering how when we think about levels of service, how do we integrate these what I would regard as innovative programs that are meant to actually, in the case of the Community Paramedic Program, absolutely was designed to address high utilizers of the system, so as to reduce 911 calls for people who have chronic illness that don't really need an emergency call but do need medical care. So it was designed to do that as part of its function. So I'm just wondering how that factors into when we're thinking around the corner on levels of service. How do we take into account those innovative programs that the city is taking a leadership position on?
Well, I think on that, it's one where the question we'd ask is the services we wish to provide are, how do we measure them? I think that's back to how you measure things. And are they inclusive? Meaning, can we provide that kind of specialized programs under the level of service umbrella we have? We have a response time level of service. That's what the state puts out for fire. It doesn't say anything about targeting specific needs and community needs. So we need to mine down a little bit and look at what that service provides and say, would that be included? If we change that, would we still be able to do these policy intent we think are really useful? And I think that's the complexity of it. That's what I was saying. You don't measure everything, but it's part of the equation. So this is not simply an exercise of just saying, well, we'll reduce the level of service or increase it here or tweak it. It's sort of, are we preserving the things we value? And then we want to make sure our capital plan allows for that to happen. So you go back and forth. You say, are we getting what we want? Yes, this is what we're looking for, we expect. Will it be provided here? No, we'll have to tweak it this way to make it happen. What are the implications? That's what we'll talk about.
Council members, any more questions? No? Rick, thank you very much. I hope you got what you needed. Moshe, do you have anything else?
Nope, I don't.
Okay,
Thank you.
all right. Thank you very much for that. And again, this is going to be a very long, deliberate conversation. We're going to, a lot of thought and a lot of statistics and data will go into these conversations. So we'll have many opportunities to ask lots of questions. Okay, we have one set of minutes in front of us today. Everyone had a chance to review our committee meeting minutes for February 22nd.
Move approval.
Second. Motion has been made and seconded for meeting minutes. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Meeting minutes carry 7-0. And we're going to go to old or new business. Start with Councilmember Borneman.
Yeah, I kind of wish Chief Cook was here because I just want to throw out some words of praise to our police department. We had an incident this past week where somebody pulled a knife on one of our police officers. If this would have been in some other jurisdiction, this was justification to use deadly force. Our police department did not do that. They're well trained. They disarmed the situation without the use of deadly force. This is the second time in the last couple weeks we've had situations like that. When deadly force is used in situations, the news media is all over it, as they should be. But so often, when we have officers operating as they should be, well-trained officers doing their job and doing it in the right way, they don't hear the praise for handling that. So I just want to throw out a thank you for our police department for doing their job, Chief Cook for making sure his officers are trained on how to disarm a potentially deadly situations without the use of deadly force. So if you could pass that on to the chief and others, I would appreciate it.
You bet. Those we had the same reaction as well when we heard about those things, and yeah, they have an outstanding presence. So thank you.
Councilmember Lillquist.
Thanks, Mickey. So I've got a little kind of news to report. It has to do, it goes back to August of 2014 when the City Council approved a letter with regard to Puget Sound Energy's use of coal as a basis for providing our electricity. 1/3 of our electricity in this community actually comes from coal-fired plants in Montana. And we asked the UTC and PSC itself and our state government to help in finding a pathway to retiring that coal-fired plant. Actually, this Friday, two things happened. One of them is that a bill passed the Senate. It had already passed the House, which actually creates a financial mechanism for PSC to retire that coal-fired plant. It won't happen right away. It may not happen for 5 years, but there's a way that they can set up an established retirement account and a remediation account and a cleanup account for closing down that plant, which they couldn't do under the regulatory mechanism. That has to do with how the UTC oversees PSC to make sure they're being fair to ratepayers. So the second bit of news is actually the UTC. This Friday I was also down in Olympia and I testified before the UTC on this issue. I re-delivered this letter. They'd actually received it a year and a half ago, asking the UTC to work with PSC with their called IRP, their integrated resource plan, to write in specifically how they would go about decommissioning this plant over the next few years and protect ratepayers at the same time. I bring this up because we took action over a year and a half ago, as did many other cities, and I think it shows that we can speak up on broader issues, statewide issues, and have an influence. We were only one of many communities, but we were one of the earliest communities. And so I think we stepped out and showed good leadership on this issue, and I really appreciate UTC and the legislature and PSC for responding.
Thank you, Michael. Councilmember Barker.
So we have some sad news to report in Ward 1. many employees at the Albertsons were given notice. The Albertsons will be closing its doors. It will create a food desert in the Birchwood area, as well as that's a stop for many people coming out. It's their very first stop to get services. So as far as we know, there's no plan to reopen the store, that it will be a full closure. And unfortunately, it's been open, I think, since the 60s. We have a neighbor that's been walking to work for 32 years that is not ready to retire, that will have to be relocated, hopefully. And many of the employees were working in the neighborhood, had bought condos because of it, and are renting there because they have a job. So I really want to extend a huge thank you to Rick to responding to me over the weekend, because the neighborhood was in a bit of a urgent state. I think a lot of people are very nervous and scared for what that means for our residents that are already so highly impacted. And he responded in kind, and it sounds like hopefully we'll start trying to make a plan to decide how we can try to make sure that we have the least amount of unintended consequences from a private business's decision. So with that, it's very, I guess, it falls on very good timing, because the Western Washington University has worked with the Urban Transition Studios, worked in many different changes and possibilities within the city. State Street was one of them, and they've chosen the Birchwood neighborhood in this particular sector. They've been working with the neighborhood for well over, I think, about 5 months now, and they're going to have a final presentation, of course, not knowing that the Albertson would be closing, on March 15th at 6 p.m. at Northwood Hall, and they're going to present 4 different concepts that are all mixed density, mixed zoning, mixed use, that's the word. And I think there will probably be a really good conversation there about, they use words like hardscape and softscape. And what's hardscape? Hardscape is something that you don't want to change. And here in this conversation, Albertsons was hardscape. It was, there has to be a grocery store here. And there was nobody thinking in those conversations that would be an impact, that would be a softscape. So if you can attend, I think it'll be a really great presentation by them, and hopefully it will spur some conversations on what we can do next. So thank you.
Okay, one other thing on behalf of the council. For those of you who are unaware, City Council, us, don't really have a lot of meeting space, and we're really confined in regards to our space. And in the fall, we will be getting offices. But in the meantime, I wanted to thank Ted Carlson and Myron Carlson and Public Works for getting us a room in the Federal Building. So soon, City Council will have room 211 in the Federal Building, and you'll be able to visit us there, and we'll have office hours that you'll make appointment for. So thank you very much to Public Works and to Ted and everyone else who managed all that facilitation discussion around us getting offices. So thanks everybody for that. We do have one executive session today. They are closed to the public, and there will be a report out meeting tonight. We have 2 items in executive session. One is potential litigation, approximately 10 minutes, and another potential property acquisition for 10 minutes. Our executive session is expected to last approximately 20 minutes. Everyone else will adjourn, and I will expect to be back here at 2:30 p.m. Thank you.